Before we dive into today's terrifying tale, make sure to hit that like button and subscribe to my channel. Don't forget to click the bell icon so you never miss a spine-chilling story. Let's get into it. The voice on the other side.
I never imagined that moving to a small town in the Midwest would be the fresh start I desperately needed. After the chaos of my breakup, the idea of a quiet, peaceful life in a place where no one knew my name seemed like a dream come true. I found a charming little apartment in a quaint town, surrounded by rolling hills and farmlands. It was the kind of place where people smiled at each other on the street, and everyone knew everyone's business. For some, that might have been stifling, but for me, it was comforting. My days quickly fell into a soothing routine. I'd wake up early, brew a pot of coffee, and enjoy the morning light streaming through the kitchen windows. I'd take long walks in the nearby woods, letting the fresh air clear my mind of all the memories I was trying to leave behind. Work was uneventful but satisfying, and I found solace in the simplicity of my new life. My apartment, though small, felt like a safe haven, a place where I could finally breathe. But it was quiet, almost too quiet. The kind of quiet that makes you hyper-aware of every creak, every gust of wind against the windows. At first, I relished it. I told myself this was what peace felt like, that I had earned this tranquility after the tumultuous year I'd endured. But as the days turned into weeks, the isolation began to feel less like a blessing and more like a weight pressing down on me. It was on one of those eerily silent nights, when the only sound was the hum of the refrigerator, that it happened. I was curled up in bed, my eyelids heavy with sleep, when the phone rang. The sudden noise made me jump, and I fumbled for my phone on the nightstand, wondering who could be calling at such an hour. The screen displayed an unknown number, which was odd, but not alarming. I figured it was probably a wrong number or a late-night telemarketer. "Hello," I answered, my voice groggy with sleep. There was a pause on the other end, long enough to make me think the caller had hung up. But then, I heard it, a voice, calm and deliberate, but somehow unnerving in its simplicity. "Emily. Just my name. Nothing more, nothing less." I felt a chill run down my spine, but I quickly shook it off. "Who is this?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. No answer. Just my name again, whispered this time, as if the person on the other end was standing right behind me. "Emily." I hung up, my heart pounding. It was probably just a prank, some bored teenager trying to get a rise out of a random stranger. I tried to convince myself of that as I set the phone down and pulled the covers up to my chin, but the unease lingered. My mind kept replaying the way my name sounded on that stranger's lips, as if it wasn't just a name, but something more, a possession, a claim. The next morning, I brushed it off as nothing more than a weird incident, something to laugh about with a friend if I had any around here. But as the day wore on, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I found myself glancing over my shoulder more often, checking the locks on the doors and windows, making sure they were secure. Every little noise in the apartment seemed amplified, every shadow stretched just a bit too long. I told myself I was being ridiculous, that I was just not used to living alone in such a quiet place. But deep down, I knew that something had shifted. The sense of peace I'd felt in this new home was starting to unravel, replaced by a growing sense of unease. And I couldn't help but wonder if that voice on the other end of the line was just the beginning of something far more sinister. I thought the first call was a one-off, a creepy but ultimately harmless prank that I could laugh about later. But it wasn't. The next night, just as I was about to fall asleep, my phone rang again. This time, the voice didn't just say my name. "Emily." It began with that same unnerving calm. "You look nice in that blue sweater." I sat up in bed, my heart pounding. I was wearing a blue sweater. My eyes darted around the room, trying to find some rational explanation. Maybe it was just a lucky guess, but the dread gnawing at my insides told me otherwise. The calls didn't stop. Every night, the phone would ring, always around the same time, just as I was about to drift off. And each time, the voice grew bolder. It described what I'd eaten for dinner. "Pasta again, Emily?" And mentioned how I liked to leave the window slightly open when I slept. It even knew about the tiny scar on my left ankle, a detail so insignificant that I hadn't thought about it in years. The worst part was that the voice never sounded angry or mocking. It was just calm, like someone who knew me intimately, who was completely confident in their control over me. It terrified me more than if they had screamed or threatened me. I couldn't take it anymore. My anxiety was through the roof. I started jumping at every little sound, constantly checking my phone to see if the number would appear again. I knew I had to do something, so I called the phone company, desperate to trace the calls, to find out who was doing this to me. The customer service representative was sympathetic but ultimately unhelpful. "I'm sorry, ma'am," she said after what felt like an eternity on hold. "The number is unlisted and untraceable. There's nothing we can do." I felt a cold wave of fear wash over me. Untraceable? What kind of person uses an untraceable number to harass someone? The idea that there was no way to find out who was doing this, or to stop them, made me feel more trapped than ever. My apartment, once my sanctuary, now felt like a prison, its walls closing in on me. The calls became more and more personal, each one revealing some new, terrifying detail about my life. The voice mentioned things that no one should know, like how I kept my spare key hidden under the flower pot outside or how I'd cried myself to sleep the night before. But it was the mention of my ex-boyfriend that finally pushed me over the edge. "Do you miss him, Emily? The way he used to hold you? He's not worth it, you know." My blood ran cold. How could this person know something so intimate, so recent? The only person who could possibly know this was my ex, and the thought that he might be behind the calls filled me with both fear and anger. I had to know if he was the one tormenting me, so I decided to confront him. The drive to his place was tense, my mind racing with possibilities. Was this his twisted way of getting back at me? Had our breakup hurt him more than I realized? When I arrived, I pounded on his door, my heart racing with a mix of fear and fury. When he finally opened the door, he looked genuinely surprised to see me. "Emily, what are you doing here?" "I need to talk to you," I said, pushing past him into the living room. "Have you been calling me? Messing with me?" He looked genuinely confused. "What are you talking about?" "I've been out of town for weeks. I just got back yesterday." He showed me his suitcase, still packed and sitting by the door. The truth hit me like a punch to the gut. It wasn't him. I left his place feeling more alone and terrified than ever. The only lead I had was a dead end, and I was right back where I started, with no idea who was calling me or why. On the drive home, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being followed. A car had been behind me for the last few miles, keeping just enough distance to not seem suspicious, but close enough that I couldn't ignore it. My hands gripped the steering wheel tighter as I tried to get a better look at the car through my rearview mirror. It was too dark to make out the driver's face, but the car was definitely there, following me. Just when I thought about pulling over to confront whoever was tailing me, the car suddenly sped up, past me, and disappeared into the night. I was left alone on the road, my heart pounding in my chest. When I finally got home, I ran inside and double-checked all the locks. I even pushed a chair up against the door, as if that could somehow keep the fear out. But I knew, deep down, that the danger wasn't just outside, it was already inside, watching, waiting. And I had no idea what to do next. The unsettling feeling that had taken root in my mind was no longer just paranoia. It was becoming a terrifying reality. I began to notice small, almost imperceptible changes in my apartment. A book slightly askew on the shelf, a cabinet door left ajar that I was certain I had closed, and the windows, always the windows. I was meticulous about closing and locking them before leaving, yet more than once, I returned home to find one cracked open, just enough to let in the night air. Each discovery sent a shiver down my spine, confirming what I was already dreading. Someone had been inside. The calls, once a nightly occurrence, began to happen multiple times each night. The voice on the other end was no longer just speaking. It was breathing, heavy and deliberate, as if the caller was standing right next to me. Each breath felt like a taunt, a reminder that they were always watching, always waiting. The sense of violation was overwhelming. My apartment, once my safe haven, was now a place of constant fear. I started sleeping with the lights on, but even that offered little comfort. Desperation drove me to contact the local police. I explained everything, the calls, the strange disturbances in my apartment, the feeling of being watched, but the officer who came to take my statement seemed disinterested. He offered a sympathetic smile but dismissed my concerns with a patronizing tone. "It's probably just stress," he said. "Maybe you're imagining things. Moving to a new place can be hard, especially after what you've been through." His words felt like a slap in the face. I wasn't imagining this. I wasn't crazy. But to him, I was just another overworked, paranoid woman living alone. Feeling more alone than ever, I decided to take matters into my own hands. I ordered security cameras and installed them around my apartment, covering every possible entry point. If someone was sneaking into my home, I was determined to catch them on camera. The very act of setting up the cameras gave me a small sense of control, a flicker of hope that I could put an end to this nightmare. I told myself that once I had proof, the police would have to take me seriously. A few nights later, after another terrifying call, I sat down to review the footage. My hands trembled as I clicked through the files, my heart racing with both fear and anticipation. For a while, there was nothing, just static images of my empty apartment, the soft hum of the refrigerator in the background. But then, as I scanned the footage from outside my front door, I saw it. A shadowy figure, barely visible in the darkness, standing just outside my apartment. My breath caught in my throat as I watched the figure linger for a few moments before disappearing into the night. The figure was too indistinct to make out any features, but its presence confirmed my worst fears. Someone was watching me, stalking me, and they were close. The thought that this person had been standing just outside, mere feet away from where I had been sitting, sent waves of panic crashing over me. I felt trapped, suffocated by the knowledge that whoever was doing this wasn't just some anonymous voice on the phone. They were here, physically close, and I had no idea who they were or what they wanted. As I sat there, staring at the screen, a horrifying realization crept into my mind. If this person could get so close without me noticing, what else were they capable of? And how long had they been watching me without my knowledge? The fear that had been steadily growing within me now felt like a living thing, tightening its grip around my chest. I wasn't safe here. I wasn't safe anywhere. And the worst part was, I didn't know how to make it stop. The sense of helplessness was unbearable, but I knew I couldn't sit idly by any longer. I had to find out who was behind these terrifying calls and why they had chosen me as their target. My first step was to dig into the history of the apartment building, hoping that the past might hold some answers. The manager of the building was reluctant to provide any details, but with some persistence and a little bit of charm, I managed to access old records and newspaper clippings about the building and its former tenants. As I combed through the documents, I stumbled upon the story of a woman who had lived in my apartment several years ago. Her name was Claire Matthews, and according to the reports, she had gone missing under mysterious circumstances. The case had never been solved, and her disappearance remained an open wound in the community. The more I read about Claire, the more unsettled I became. There were eerie similarities between her life and mine. Both of us had moved to this small town for a fresh start. Both of us had experienced strange occurrences in the apartment, and now I was beginning to fear that her fate might soon become mine. My determination to uncover the truth grew stronger with each passing day, but so did the terror. The calls, which had been menacing enough, took a nightmarish turn. The voice on the other end began to change, morphing into something that sent chills down my spine. It started to mimic Claire's voice, recounting her last days in haunting detail. The way it spoke, as if reliving her life, was beyond disturbing. It was as if Claire herself was trying to reach out from beyond the grave, or worse, someone who knew her every move was now watching me. Each call was more horrifying than the last. The voice described intimate details of Claire's life, things that no one should know, what she wore, what she ate, even her innermost thoughts and fears. As I listened, I realized with a sickening dread that the voice wasn't just recounting Claire's life, it was mirroring mine. The parallels were too close to be a coincidence, and I began to fear that whoever was tormenting me had done the same to her, right up until the day she vanished. Desperation drove me to seek out former tenants of the building, hoping that someone might have experienced something similar. After days of searching, I finally connected with a woman who had lived in the apartment before Claire. Her voice trembled as she recounted her own experiences. Mysterious calls, strange happenings, the feeling of being watched. She had been lucky enough to escape, but not without scars. Her parting words were a chilling warning. The calls are just the beginning. He's connected to that place, to you. He's been watching you, waiting for the right moment. Her words echoed in my mind, a terrifying confirmation of what I had begun to suspect. Whoever this stalker was, they weren't just some random intruder. They were someone with a deep, twisted connection to the apartment, and now to me. The realization sent waves of panic coursing through me. The walls of my apartment, once a sanctuary, now felt like a cage, closing in around me as I tried to piece together the fragments of a mystery that was quickly becoming my own worst nightmare. The realization hit me like a freight train. Someone I knew, someone I had trusted, was behind all of this. The final piece of the puzzle fell into place one evening when I noticed something disturbingly familiar about a conversation I had with my neighbor, Mrs. Hargrove. She was always so kind, always checking in on me, bringing me homemade cookies and offering to help with anything I needed. But that day, she mentioned something only the voice on the phone could have known. My blood ran cold as I slowly connected the dots. I confronted her the next morning, my heart pounding in my chest. Mrs. Hargrove didn't even try to deny it. Her warm, grandmotherly demeanor faded, replaced by something darker, more menacing. She admitted to everything: how she had terrorized Claire, how she had manipulated the other tenants, and now, how she had chosen me as her next victim. She spoke with a twisted sense of satisfaction, relishing the control she had over us, over me. It was never just about the calls. It was about power, about making us live in fear under her watchful eyes. The confrontation escalated quickly. I tried to escape, but she was faster than I expected for someone her age. She knew the apartment better than I did, every nook and cranny, every weak spot in the floor, every door that creaked. It was her territory, and I was the intruder. What followed was a terrifying game of cat and mouse. I could hear her moving through the apartment, her footsteps deliberate and steady, as if she knew exactly where I was hiding. My breath caught in my throat every time she drew near, but I forced myself to stay calm, to think, to survive. I made my way to the kitchen, where I knew there was a sharp knife in the drawer. My hands were shaking as I grabbed it, every nerve in my body on high alert. Just as I turned around, she was there, blocking my only escape route. Her eyes were filled with a sickening glee as she advanced, and I knew that this was it: either I fought back or I died. With every ounce of strength and determination I had left, I lunged at her. What followed was a brutal struggle, the small apartment echoing with the sounds of our desperate fight. Somehow, I managed to overpower her, delivering a final blow that left her crumpled on the floor. I was covered in sweat, tears streaming down my face as I stood over her, the knife trembling in my hand. The adrenaline was still coursing through my veins as I stumbled back, horrified by what I had just done but relieved that the nightmare was finally over. Or so I thought. The days that followed were a blur of police interviews and packing up my belongings. The authorities assured me that Mrs. Hargrove would never hurt anyone again, but the experience had left its mark. Even as I moved out of the apartment, I couldn't shake the feeling that she was still watching me, waiting for the right moment to strike. The final night in that place, as I closed the door behind me, I heard it, the faintest whisper of my name, carried on the wind. I froze, heart hammering in my chest, before shaking it off and walking away. But deep down, I knew that some fears don't die so easily, and I would always wonder if the terror was truly over, or if it would find its way back to me, or someone else, someday.
The Early Morning Delivery Man.
My name is Michael, and for the past few months, I've been living alone in a small, quiet town in the Midwest. My house is in one of those suburban neighborhoods where everyone knows everyone, or at least pretends to. I moved here to escape the chaos of my past, a fresh start, or so I hoped. My life here is simple, uneventful. I wake up early, go to work at a local hardware store, come home, and spend my evenings in solitude. It's a peaceful existence, one that I've come to appreciate, even if it's a little lonely at times. The house itself is old but cozy, a two-bedroom place with a small yard and a porch that creaks whenever the wind blows. It's far enough from the main road that I rarely hear any traffic, which makes the nights especially quiet. Too quiet, sometimes. But that's what I wanted: quiet. A place where I could forget the things I'd rather not remember, where I could live without being haunted by the mistakes I made years ago. But then, one night, that peace was shattered. It was around 3 a.m., and I was in the middle of a restless sleep when I heard a noise, something being placed on my porch. The sound was so out of place in the stillness of the night that it woke me instantly. My heart pounded in my chest as I lay there, listening, straining to hear anything else. When nothing followed, I forced myself out of bed and crept to the front door, peering through the peephole. I saw nothing but darkness, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was out there. I hesitated for a moment before unlocking the door and stepping out onto the porch. The air was cold, and the only light came from the dim glow of the street lamp at the end of the block. That's when I saw it, a small, unmarked package sitting right on my doorstep. No address, no label, just a plain brown box. My first thought was that it was some sort of mistake, maybe a delivery meant for one of my neighbors. But when I picked it up, it felt heavy, significant, as if it had been placed there with intent. Curiosity got the better of me, and I took the package inside, placing it on the kitchen table. My hands were shaking slightly as I tore open the paper. Inside, nestled in a bed of old newspaper clippings, was a doll. It was old, worn, with faded fabric and missing buttons for eyes. The sight of it sent a chill down my spine, stirring up a memory I couldn't quite place. Something from my childhood, something I'd long since buried. I wanted to dismiss it as a prank, maybe some kids from the neighborhood messing around, but the feeling of unease lingered, clinging to me like a shadow. That night, I couldn't shake the sense that I was being watched. Every creak of the house, every rustle of the wind outside felt amplified, like a whisper in the dark. I found myself checking the locks on the doors and windows more than once, making sure everything was secure. I told myself it was just nerves, just the strangeness of the package getting to me, but deep down, I knew something wasn't right. It was as if that doll, that small, unassuming object, had brought something with it, something that was waiting, just out of sight, ready to step into the light. The strange deliveries didn't stop with just that first package. Over the next few nights, I found more packages waiting for me on the porch. Each one was wrapped in plain brown paper, no labels or return addresses. When I opened them, I found items that grew increasingly disturbing. One night, it was a newspaper clipping about a decades-old unsolved crime, a murder that took place not far from here. Another night, it was an old photograph of someone I vaguely recognized from my past but couldn't quite place. Then, there was a broken piece of jewelry that seemed oddly familiar, like it belonged to someone I knew, or perhaps someone I'd forgotten. The more these packages arrived, the more my anxiety grew. I started staying up late, hoping to catch whoever was leaving them. But each night, I'd fall asleep on the couch, exhausted and tense, only to wake up to find another package on my doorstep. It was as if someone knew exactly how to push my buttons, how to dig up memories I'd tried so hard to bury. The items felt like personal jabs, reminders of a past I couldn't escape. Desperate to stop the deliveries, I reached out to the delivery companies, hoping to trace the source. I also contacted the police, but they had no records of any deliveries to my address. The packages seemed to come from nowhere, untraceable and inexplicable. I even tried to return the items, hoping that sending them back would put an end to this madness. But no matter what I did, the packages always found their way back to me. Every time I opened a new package, my sense of dread grew. The items weren't just strange, they were deeply personal, connected to memories I'd rather forget. It felt like whoever was sending them knew my past intimately, knew the things I tried to erase. The more I tried to get rid of them, the more I felt like I was being targeted, like someone was toying with me, watching from the shadows. I started feeling like I was losing control. My home, which had once been a place of refuge, now felt like a trap. I couldn't escape the feeling that I was being watched, that someone was always just out of sight, waiting for the right moment to strike. Each morning when I found a new package, it was like another piece of the puzzle falling into place, a puzzle I didn't want to solve. The creeping sense of paranoia began to take over my life. I started locking my doors and windows obsessively, double-checking every sound that came from outside. The terror was relentless, eating away at my peace of mind. I knew I had to find out who was behind these packages and why they were targeting me, but the more I delved into it, the more I realized how deeply this was connected to my past, and how much danger I might be in. As I began to examine each item from the packages more closely, a chilling pattern started to emerge. The doll from the first package belonged to a childhood friend who died under mysterious circumstances, something I had tried to forget for years. The newspaper clipping described a crime I had witnessed but never reported, a guilty secret that had haunted me for too long. And then there was the photograph of someone I had wronged in my youth, someone whose life had been shattered because of me. Each item seemed to dredge up a dark chapter of my past, each one tied to moments of guilt and shame I thought I had buried. I couldn't ignore the connection between these items and the personal history they unearthed. It was as if someone knew every detail of my life, every regret and unresolved trauma. My first instinct was to try and piece together who could have such intimate knowledge of my past. But the more I investigated, the clearer it became that whoever was behind this had a deep-seated motive, a need to remind me of the mistakes I'd made and the pain I'd caused. Things took a darker turn when I started receiving phone calls in the dead of night. The calls were always from an unknown number, and the voice on the other end was heavily distorted. It spoke with a sinister familiarity, taunting me with details only someone who truly knew me could possess. Each call was a fresh dose of terror, a reminder that my past was not just lingering, it was actively hunting me down. The voice hinted at more to come, leaving me on edge, wondering what new horrors awaited. The realization hit me hard. Whoever was orchestrating this nightmare wasn't just trying to scare me. They were intent on making me confront my darkest secrets. They knew everything I'd tried to forget, and they seemed determined to make me relive it all. It was like a cruel game where I was forced to face the consequences of my actions from years ago. I began to fear for my safety, realizing that my past mistakes had caught up with me in ways I had never imagined. The weight of my guilt seemed to manifest in physical form, with each new package and phone call acting as a grotesque reminder of what I had done. The more I thought about it, the more I felt trapped, as if there was no escaping the consequences of my past. The terror of knowing that my past was so intricately woven into this present nightmare was overwhelming. I was left grappling with the fear that this torment would only escalate, and that no matter how hard I tried to make things right, the sins of my past would continue to come back and haunt me. The packages kept arriving, each one more disturbing than the last. One night, I opened a package to find a blood-stained piece of clothing that immediately sent chills down my spine. It was unmistakable, an old shirt from a terrible incident I was involved in years ago, a secret I thought was buried forever. The sight of it brought back the raw, haunting memory of that night, a night I had hoped to erase from my life. The realization that someone had unearthed it, that they knew this intimate and awful detail of my past, filled me with a terror I couldn't describe. My home, which had once been a sanctuary, had turned into a prison. It felt like the walls were closing in on me. Strange noises began to plague my nights, footsteps in the hallways, whispers that seemed to seep through the walls. The comfort I had once found in my quiet suburban refuge was gone, replaced by a constant, gnawing fear. Every creak and groan of the house seemed to whisper threats, making it clear that the packages were designed to torment me, pushing me closer and closer to madness. I tried to escape, hoping that leaving town might break the cycle of terror. But no matter where I went, I found myself inexplicably drawn back. It was as if an invisible force was pulling me back to that house, keeping me trapped in a nightmare I couldn't wake from. The calls grew more frequent and intense, the voice on the other end becoming increasingly menacing. It was no longer just taunting me, it was demanding retribution for my sins. Every time I returned home, the feeling of being watched became more palpable. The calls weren't just threats, they were accusations, a relentless reminder that I had something to atone for. I became convinced that there was something in the house with me, something connected to the packages and the phone calls. It was as if my own home had turned against me, becoming a stage for the horrors of my past to play out in real time. The fear that had started as an unsettling feeling now grew into full-blown paranoia. I would lock every door and window multiple times, only to feel a creeping sense of dread that someone, or something, was already inside. The whispers and footsteps made it clear that I was not alone, and each new package seemed to validate that there was a force beyond my understanding orchestrating this hellish game. I felt like I was losing my grip on reality. The boundaries between my past and present began to blur, making it hard to distinguish where the true danger lay. The house that was supposed to be my safe haven had become a trap, and the terror that once felt like a distant memory was now a living nightmare I couldn't escape. Desperation drove me to set a trap, hoping to finally put an end to the torment that had consumed my life. Armed with a flashlight and a makeshift weapon, I stayed awake all night, my eyes fixed on the front door. The quiet of the house was interrupted only by the occasional creak or distant thud, each sound amplifying my anxiety. I was ready to confront whoever had turned my life into a living nightmare, determined to put an end to the madness. But when the moment came, I was met with a horrifying revelation. The person behind the deliveries was not a faceless stranger as I had feared. To my utter shock, it was someone from my past, someone I thought was long gone. Standing before me was Emily, a figure from a dark chapter of my life. Her eyes were filled with a mix of anger and sadness as she revealed her true identity. She had been watching me, orchestrating the nightmare to make me confront the suffering I had caused her. She blamed me for the pain and loss she endured, and now she sought revenge. As the confrontation unfolded, Emily handed me the final package. Inside was a letter that detailed the full extent of my sins and the reasons behind her torment. The letter exposed the depth of her suffering and how she had been manipulated by an even darker force, one I had unknowingly been connected to. My past actions had not only hurt her, but had also set her on a path of misery orchestrated by a sinister entity. The realization that she, too, was a victim of something far more malevolent was a crushing blow. With the truth laid bare, I was left to grapple with the consequences of my actions and the impact they had on others. The weight of my guilt was unbearable as I faced the reality of what my past had wrought. Emily's anguish had been amplified by a force beyond our control, a dark influence that had turned her into a pawn in its cruel game. The torment I experienced was merely a reflection of the pain I had inflicted, magnified by the malevolent force that had orchestrated it all. Despite confronting my guilt and the reasons behind the torment, I found it impossible to escape the shadows of my past. As I tried to move on, the final scene of my ordeal offered a chilling reminder that the nightmare might not be over. A new package lay on my doorstep, its presence a stark symbol that my past might forever linger, refusing to let me find peace. The dread that settled in my chest was palpable, a lingering sense that no matter how far I tried to run, the shadows of my past would always be waiting for me.
The presence in the basement.
I recently moved into an old Victorian house on the outskirts of a small town in Pennsylvania. The move was supposed to be a fresh start after a turbulent year, and the house, with its creaky charm and expansive rooms, seemed like the perfect escape. My life had become a routine of unpacking and settling in, and I found solace in the quiet isolation of my new home. It was peaceful, though a bit eerie with its long hallways and dim corners. It began with the basement lights flickering on and off at odd hours. At first, I thought it was just an electrical issue. I dismissed it as an old house quirk and focused on unpacking the rest of my belongings. The lights would go out by themselves, but nothing seemed to be out of the ordinary except for a faint feeling of unease that lingered in the back of my mind. As nights went by, the flickering lights became more frequent, and I started hearing faint sounds of footsteps and whispers coming from the basement. I attributed it to the house settling, or perhaps my imagination running wild, but the sounds grew louder and more persistent. Despite my growing apprehension, I avoided the basement, hoping that my fears were just a product of stress and fatigue. I would lie in bed, straining to hear what was causing those unsettling noises, convinced that I was merely overreacting. Yet, every creak and groan of the house seemed amplified in the dead of night. The basement, once a mere inconvenience in my unpacking schedule, had become a source of mounting dread. One evening, as I was settling in for the night, the lights in the basement flickered violently, casting erratic shadows through the small window above the door. My heart raced as I stood at the top of the stairs, staring down into the darkness. I could almost feel a presence watching me from below. I hesitated, then quickly turned away, telling myself it was just my imagination playing tricks on me. The uneasy feeling persisted, making me question whether this house was really the sanctuary I had hoped for. Each night, the lights continued their erratic dance, and the whispers grew more insistent. Despite my attempts to ignore them, it became increasingly clear that something was wrong with the basement, or perhaps with me. The disturbances continued, and the basement lights would turn on by themselves, even when I was sure I had turned them off. The sounds became more pronounced, with distinct footsteps and eerie whispers that seemed to echo through the walls. I started keeping a notebook, documenting each strange occurrence, trying to find a logical explanation. I thought maybe an old electrical fault was the cause, or perhaps there were animals in the basement creating the noises. One night, after a particularly unsettling series of noises, I decided to take a flashlight and check the basement. The stairs creaked with every step I took, and the air was colder than the rest of the house. As I reached the bottom, the lights flickered violently, casting long, menacing shadows. I could see nothing out of place, but the sense of being watched grew stronger. The flashlight's beam revealed old storage boxes and dusty furniture, but nothing seemed amiss. Despite my attempts to rationalize the noises, I couldn't shake the feeling that something, or someone, was down there with me. I could feel the oppressive weight of the darkness surrounding me, making it hard to breathe. The whispers seemed to be coming from all directions, but when I tried to pinpoint their source, there was nothing. I quickly retreated upstairs, my heart pounding. I started avoiding the basement altogether, feeling a sense of dread every time I had to pass by the basement door. The thought of going down there made me shiver. I found myself checking the locks on all the doors and windows more frequently, convinced that something was wrong. I even considered calling an electrician, but part of me feared that addressing the issue might make things worse. The fear began to invade my daily life, causing me to jump at the smallest noises and struggle to concentrate. I'd hear creaks in the house and immediately think of the basement, my mind racing with dark possibilities. It was as though the basement had a magnetic pull on my anxiety, drawing my thoughts and fears to it like a dark hole. Even with the lights off and the house in silence, I felt a constant, nagging unease. The basement had become a shadowy presence in my life, a looming threat that seemed to grow with each passing day. The more I tried to ignore it, the more it seemed to take control of my mind, leaving me on edge and desperate for answers. I began to investigate the items in the packages, trying to find a connection between them. Each item seemed to relate to a dark chapter of my life. Moments of guilt, shame, and unresolved trauma. The doll from the first package belonged to a childhood friend who died under mysterious circumstances. I had never fully understood her death, but the doll brought back painful memories. The newspaper clipping detailed a crime I witnessed but never reported, an incident I had buried deep within myself. The photograph was of someone I had wronged in my youth, a person whose life had been irrevocably changed because of my actions. The more I dug into the connections, the more unsettling it became. I found myself haunted by my past mistakes, replaying old regrets over and over in my mind. As I grappled with these revelations, I started receiving phone calls in the middle of the night from an unknown number. The voice on the other end was distorted, making it hard to decipher, but it seemed to know everything about me. It taunted me about the past, hinting at more to come. Each call left me shaking and paranoid, feeling as though someone, or something, was lurking in the shadows, watching my every move. The realization hit me like a ton of bricks. Whoever was behind the packages knew my darkest secrets and was determined to make me confront them. It wasn't just some random prank or a series of eerie coincidences. This was a deliberate and personal attack, designed to unearth and torment me with my own buried guilt. The packages and calls weren't merely unsettling, they were deeply threatening, a reminder that my past could come back to haunt me in the most cruel and unexpected ways. I felt trapped in a nightmare I couldn't wake up from. Each package was a direct link to a part of my life I had tried to forget, each call a chilling reminder that my past was not as dead and buried as I had hoped. I began to fear that my past mistakes had caught up with me in a way I never anticipated. The more I tried to ignore it, the more relentless it became, pushing me further into a state of dread and paranoia. Desperation began to set in as I struggled to find a way to stop the torment. I thought about contacting the authorities again, but the fear that they would dismiss my concerns as delusional kept me from reaching out. It felt like I was fighting against something that was always one step ahead of me, a force that knew exactly how to exploit my deepest fears. I spent countless nights sleepless, pacing around my house and anxiously checking every corner. The once peaceful environment had become a prison of fear, and I was growing more convinced that whoever was behind this had a plan far more sinister than I could ever imagine. The connection to my past was clear, but the full extent of the mystery remained just out of reach, leaving me with a gnawing sense of impending doom. The deliveries became increasingly personal and terrifying. One night, I received a package that left me paralyzed with fear. Inside was a blood-stained piece of clothing I recognized from an incident I was involved in years ago, something I had hoped was buried forever. Seeing that garment brought a rush of memories, each one darker than the last. The sense of dread and guilt that overwhelmed me was almost too much to bear. My home, once a refuge from the world, had transformed into a prison. Strange noises became a nightly occurrence. Footsteps echoed through the hallways, and whispers slithered through the walls. The house, once my sanctuary, now felt like it was closing in on me, every creak and groan a reminder of the terror that had taken root. The packages kept coming, each one more disturbing than the last, each one designed to drive me closer to madness. I could no longer escape the feeling that the house itself was conspiring against me. Every corner seemed to hold secrets, every shadow seemed to harbor a threat. The sense of being watched was constant, and no matter where I went within the house, I felt as though I was being silently judged by something unseen. The walls seemed to pulse with malevolent energy, and the air was thick with a pervasive sense of dread. Desperate to escape the nightmare, I decided to leave the house, believing that a change of environment might offer some reprieve. I packed a few belongings, determined to flee from the terror that had engulfed my life. However, My attempts to escape were thwarted at every turn. Doors would lock themselves with a chilling finality, and my car refused to start, as if some unseen force was deliberately keeping me confined. Every effort to leave the house felt like a futile struggle against something far more powerful than I could comprehend. It was as if the house itself was holding me captive, determined to force me to confront whatever was lurking within its walls. The walls seemed to close in on me, and every attempt to break free only deepened my sense of entrapment. The realization that I was being manipulated by some malevolent force within my own home was crushing. I was no longer just dealing with eerie packages and unsettling noises. I was facing a relentless entity that seemed bent on unraveling my sanity. The fear was no longer confined to the night, but had become an ever-present, suffocating presence in my life. The house had become a trap, and I was its prey, trapped in a nightmare with no apparent escape. In a final attempt to end the torment, I set a trap to catch the person behind the mysterious packages. Armed with a flashlight and a sense of grim determination, I stayed awake all night, my nerves taut with anticipation. Every creak of the house seemed magnified in the dead silence, and the shadows in the corners danced mockingly as I waited. I needed to confront whoever, or whatever, was orchestrating this nightmare and put an end to it once and for all. When the time finally came, my breath caught in my throat as I faced a horrifying truth. The person behind the deliveries was not some faceless stranger, but someone from my past I had long believed was gone forever. Standing before me was someone who had suffered greatly due to my actions, a person whose life I had unknowingly shattered. Their eyes were filled with a mixture of vengeance and pain, and their presence was a chilling reminder of the consequences of my past mistakes. The final package I received contained a letter, and as I read it, the full extent of my past sins was laid bare. The letter detailed how the torment I had been enduring was not merely about revenge, but part of a larger, more malevolent scheme. The person behind the packages had been manipulated by an even darker force, a sinister presence that had used their suffering to torment me. The presence in the basement, which I had feared so intensely, was a manifestation of this darker force's influence. The revelation struck me with the force of a physical blow. The torment I had experienced was only a piece of a much larger, more complex puzzle. The realization that I had been part of a twisted game orchestrated by an unseen malevolence left me feeling hollow and exposed. The weight of my guilt and the understanding of the malevolent forces at play were almost too much to bear. Though I managed to leave the house, the experience left me forever scarred. I relocated to a new place, hoping for a fresh start, but the shadows of the past refused to stay buried. Every creak of a floorboard, every whisper of the wind against the window sends shivers down my spine. The sense of dread and the fear that the nightmare might never truly end cling to me, a constant reminder of the darkness I cannot escape. The final scene of my ordeal leaves me with a chilling reminder. The past cannot truly be escaped, and the horrors I faced may never be fully behind me. The nightmares, the fear, and the lingering sense of dread are now a part of me, a haunting echo of a nightmare that, despite my attempts to flee, might never fully release its grip on my life.